For most people, your house is the biggest investment you will ever make, if you can afford one. The last few years have seen house prices rise to the point that many people can't afford to buy. Joining us is Hillard MacBeth. He's a portfolio manager in Edmonton and author of a new book called When the Bubble Bursts: Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. Hillard, thanks so much for joining us today. You believe the housing bubble is going to burst soon. Why is this?
Well, Lisa, nice to be on your show. Yes, it's been a long time in the building, and it's interesting the intro that you gave, the housing bubble. So some people are still debating whether there actually is a bubble, but in my discussions with my clients, and I've been doing this for 36 years now, I noticed in the last 5 to 10 years, people becoming more and more obsessed with real estate. And you notice this if you go to a social event or something, people are talking all the time about housing and affordability, and those are the symptoms of a bubble. And one of the reasons why I'm convinced it's going to happen is that all bubbles burst, and the trend line is where the bubble usually will go back to. So unfortunately for Canadians, that's a fairly significant price drop.
House prices in Canada, they've grown much faster than income. So how much are we talking? How overpriced do you think they are right now?
Well, if you take, I mean, you can take the line back different amounts, but the one that I've keyed on is 1975. So if you go back to 1975 in Canada, house prices, to keep pace with inflation, should have increased 4 times. So that would just mean that your house was basically staying the same value, adjusted for the amount of inflation in the economy. And in Canada, we've increased 9 times, so more than double the rate of inflation. And over the decades, if you go back prior to that bubble, house prices have generally just kept up with inflation. There's never been any long period of house prices going faster than inflation. So that implies that we have to go from 9 times down to 4 times, which unfortunately is 50%.
Wow. Now, Alberta and Saskatchewan have booming economies. Would the drop in prices be as significant here as maybe elsewhere in the country?
Well, it's interesting. You know, as it turns out, I've got clients all over Canada, in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. And of course, I've been talking to them about this for months now. Wherever I go, there's a reason why that particular place is exempt from a bubble. For instance, in Vancouver, people say, yes, I can see Alberta, you know, I can see house prices crashing in Alberta because the oil price might drop and then house prices would go down. But in Vancouver, it can't happen because we've got foreign investors coming in from China, so we'll be okay. And you go to Toronto and you have the same, it's a different reason, but it's the same kind of idea. And then in my research for the book, I found out there's actually a name for it. It's called uniqueness bias. And it turns out that that's really actually not possible, that all of us can be exempt, unfortunately. But, you know, I was in Saskatoon in April, and what a wonderful city. And also I noticed that there's a lot of potash, uranium, and other natural resources activities. So it really does depend for both Alberta and Saskatchewan on the commodities. And right now, the last few weeks, we've been in a pretty serious decline in the price of some commodities. So that would be a factor. But, you know, some of these bubbles, they start to deflate for no reason at all. They just, at some point, the bubble starts to burst just out of its own exaggeration, I guess, if you like.
So, Hillard, when and how will this happen? What's your timeline for us?
Well, you know, it's going to be a 10-year or longer deflation of the bubble. So, for instance, if you took a 40% overvaluation, then at 4% a year of letting the air out of the bubble, it would be 10 years to get that done. So, you know, whether it happens starting 6 months from now or 1 year from now or a year and a half from now, it doesn't really make that much difference. If Canadians, if your listeners are over-invested in real estate, if they have too much debt, you know, now is the time to start to get that changed and get that under control. The timing doesn't really matter. The trigger, your second question, that is interesting. I've been through I was counting this up the other day, I've been through about 8 of these things, different things like the dot-com bubble stock market in 2000. And there was one you won't remember in 1981 where interest rates went to 18%. And some of them have triggers and some of them just don't. There's nothing, even years afterwards, people can't identify. For instance, the dot-com bubble, as far as I know, nobody's been able to identify a reason why all of a sudden people woke up and said, that's crazy to be buying internet stocks at 100 times earnings, or in some of the cases, they didn't have any earnings or revenue. So people just wake up one day and say, wow, this is crazy. I'm borrowing $500,000 to buy a $600,000 bungalow in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I'm not going to do that. That's nuts. And so that's the way it starts. And unfortunately with bubbles, sometimes everybody wakes up the same morning with the same idea, and that's what starts it.
Hillard MacBeth's book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. Check it out if you want more from him, more advice. And Hillard, live in Edmonton this morning. Thanks so much for making time for our show.
Thank you, Lisa.